NA FanFest just announced some new changes coming to tanks in Final Fantasy XIV, and to put it simply, those changes have been controversial. It seems most people are excited for the evolved jobs coming in the expansion, but the number who are excited specifically for this divide in tanks between off-tank and main tank is less. I don't think it's necessarily unexpected. This change could very easily be quite bad, but it does beg the question, why did they make it? Why is 14 dividing their tanks? Let's talk about it. Hello Void, it's Eldon. If you enjoy this video, please subscribe. I love seeing that number go up. A fun fact about me is that I actually used to play a lot of tank. I played Paladin through the MSQ, and my first raiding experience was as a tank. I have a lot of love in my heart for this role, so when 14 announced that they were splitting tanks between off tanks and main tanks, I was at first confused. Why? Why would they do this? Tanks are, generally speaking, in a pretty good position. All tanks are viable in all positions, and it lets certain people who like their specific job play them wherever they want to. But after thinking about it for a bit, I think I see where Square is coming from. The reason, as far as I can tell, for 14 changing tanks comes down to one simple thing. Right now, tanks don't do anything. Well, that's obviously kind of a lie, but what I mean by it more accurately is that tanks don't have any tanking mechanics. Look at any tank kit. Zero of their abilities for mitigation impact any other part of their kit, except for maybe the Dark Knight shield, but even then that's more mana recovery option than a true synergy. Across every tank kit, they have two very divided aspects. One half is dedicated to fairly standard, somewhat watered down DPS rotations, and the other half of their kit is dedicated to a bunch of very static damage mitigation buttons that are basically universal across each different tank. These do not intermix. They never create synergies. There's no action on one side that truly benefits the other. Now, in the context of 14 as it exists today, this isn't really a problem. It's nothing out of the ordinary. Most jobs have responsibilities, and those responsibilities get segregated into a much smaller portion of their kit, so it doesn't affect the primary damage rotation. This is the main way 14 stays balanced. They let each job have their individual responsibilities exist separate from their damage, so that their damage can be very controlled. So everything can fit very nicely into the burst windows that they've created. And so that each challenge they place us against can guaranteed be completed with a very specific level of difficulty, highly tuned. Yet, as we approach the arrival of evolved jobs, hopefully, this philosophy is changing. The core basis of this design is everything being very rigid. Rigid rotations, rigid responsibilities, every job having the same equivalent amount of utility through those utilities being equal, not necessarily equitable. Yet, as stated in the design panel, they want to create smaller kits with more choice and more synergy. And to do that responsibly for tanks, there are only two options. Option one is just to give tanks more condensed suite of tanking abilities and a more condensed suite of DPS abilities. We keep them very separate. We make there be a divide. This is the only real way to create true equality amongst the tanks, to keep the tanks basically all the same in terms of how much they can do. However, it's also very limiting in terms of what tank design can be and if it really is tank design at all. The other way, and in my opinion, the far more interesting option, was to create synergies between taking damage and dealing damage, to actually give tanks some amount of tanking mechanics. And apparently, this is what they did. When they showed off Paladin, they showed it as having a mechanic that allows it to parry incoming damage. If they press the button close enough to the damage point, they get a retaliatory strike, directly rewarding them damage for smartly and intelligently tanking. This kind of tank mechanic is nowhere present in the modern game, and it shows that they've taken this opportunity to radically change up how they think about the way kits work. This alone is very exciting for me. I've long been a proponent of making kits more inclusive, though honestly I didn't think they'd do it. My biggest hope was that we'd get some morsel, or maybe they'd increase the complexity of the damage rotation while still keeping them separate. But them actually deciding to mix it up to integrate both of these halves of the support jobs, it makes me really excited. It's beyond what I ever hoped for. Yet doing this specifically with tanks comes with an issue. Well, not really an issue, more like a dilemma. Is there a distinct difference between an issue and a dilemma? I digress. Essentially, when adding mechanics to tanks, there are two different points at which you could add synergy. You could add synergy actions that reward you for taking damage, or you could add synergy actions that reward you for mitigating damage on others. Those are a tank's two responsibilities in 14. Well, that and damage, but everyone deals damage. The first is to stand in front of the boss and get hit, to take auto attacks, to take tank busters. The second is generally to provide support, to mitigate the frequent AoEs, to help the party survive mechanics that would otherwise kill them. When redesigning tanks to have synergy actions, these are the two different paths you could take. And if we wanted to keep tanks as they were, they would either have to choose only one of them or choose neither. If they wanted all tanks to remain the same to maintain an equal amount of raid utility, then they could only realistically choose one of these options at a time. That might be the most controversial statement of this whole video. It's a massive presupposition, but I think it makes sense, at least to me. The stated goal of the job changes coming in Evercold is to make jobs more condensed, to reduce button bloat while making the jobs more intricate and interesting. This realistically means that each job does not have the space on the hotbar for two different core tanking systems in addition to a core damage system. Even with the current job design, the ones with 30 plus buttons, most jobs are pretty much always limited to two different systems. Modern Paladin has tank abilities and their sword combo. Ninja has their mudras and their ninki gauge. Bard has songs and big arrows. Having more than two subsystems deeply disrupts a job's fundamental flow. It creates way more of a cognitive load and just kind of makes it overall a mess. Especially with them trying to condense these flows and make them more elegant and have a smaller amount of buttons, creating jobs with all possible tank synergies is unrealistic. So they would either have to make all tank jobs use the same synergies, or they would have to allow different tank jobs to have different synergies. And from this arises the split in tank jobs. Square Enix wanted to have both different theoretical types of tanks. They wanted to have some that could do cool shit when they took damage, and others that could do cool shit when they mitigate damage for others. And in order to make that clear to players and allow for more distinct balancing, they had to put that distinction in stone. If they didn't divide the tanks with words, if they didn't say it out loud, then people would notice that some tanks are good in this way and other tanks are good in this way, that these jobs now work fundamentally differently than each other, even if they have the same ability to complete different tasks in the game. And if that goes unstated, then it creates a whole lot more bad blood than from them simply saying it out loud. I'm not gonna lie, initially the idea of off tanks and main tanks doesn't really vibe with me. I think it divides tanks in a way I don't really want. It creates less choice and restricts the flow, but I also would like to have a wider variety of tanking abilities. I want each of these jobs to feel unique, and I think shoehorning 5 jobs into the same subset of synergies is probably not going to allow that to happen, and it also just unduly restricts the amount of design space that I want to be able to work with. Part of me hopes that this distinction ends up being a failure of vernacular rather than a true limitation. I hope that they used familiar words to describe something that does not necessarily take on a familiar meaning. I mean, they already did this with seasons. Seasons is a common term for intermittent content, but the seasons they describe in FanFest are not the same thing as the seasons we normally get in modern AAA gaming. Now, I know earlier I said they couldn't mix synergies, but realistically, there is nothing stopping them from mixing up the different types of synergies on a job-by-job basis. It's not actually impossible. You can create complex kits. It just can't be systematized that every job has to have both. if they allow themselves some amount of nuance, if they invoke some subtlety in this incredibly difficult task of job design, then they can actually turn this job split into something very different. They could turn it into a spectrum of tanking jobs. We could have all tank jobs do slightly different things, act in different ways from each other, even if there is this quote-unquote split in tank jobs. That would be more some jobs falling on one side of the line versus the other. However, if they didn't say anything, if they never talked about this, then the nuance would go over most people's heads. If we go from all tanks being basically the same to each of them being variations along this vast spectrum, people wouldn't understand, or at least some subset of people would get really toxic about it in a way that was very unhelpful for the community. I don't know if this solution was better, and I don't know if it's true either. I don't know if they're actually making tanks very rigidly defined into two roles, or if they're sort of allowing them to exist along a spectrum of theoretical mitigation synergies with damage. But if they are, then this would be probably the first step. It might have been better for them not to use such meaningful language. Off tank and main tank have such strict definitions in the heads of most MMO players that they were basically just asking for trouble. But then again, creating new terms and trying to define them is also not necessarily a fruitful endeavor. When you create a new term, no one knows what it means, so everyone can understand it to mean whatever they want it to mean. So essentially, you have to choose between using terms that already exist with all the baggage they have, or using terms that will now gain baggage that you can't control. It's sort of a catch-22. Regardless, my hope is that there is this spectrum, that there's no strict divide between these designs, and that as the rest of them are revealed, we will find that some tanks lie more towards the middle, while some fall on one side or the other. If Paladin is the platonic ideal of the main tank, of the take damage, hit back, then probably Gunbreaker would be the platonic ideal of the off tank, of the do your own thing while helping others. I think Warrior could have a really interesting synergy, where maybe its defensives, its group defensives, give itself a buff depending on how much it heals people, but it could also take its own damage and gain its own buff from taking damage. I don't know. There's so much design space here. The other thing, and I kind of tagging this on at the end, that I hope we get from this change is that we are moving away from pure job tribalism. With the old gearing system, the fact that you needed slightly different BIS for each job, and that each job was incredibly difficult time-wise to get BIS on, was pretty messed up. You were kind of locked in on one job. Hopefully with them sharing eye level, we can now have a world where it's not uncommon to switch jobs, even within a Savage tier. If the kits are more condensed, if the load is less on muscle memory and more on thought process, and if it's much less restrictive to switch between jobs, hopefully we can get more diversity in sort of the normal state of play. So this actually doesn't matter as much. If you're not a Paladin player, if you're a preferred Paladin tank player, then maybe you don't have to worry that sometimes you have to play Paladin and sometimes you have to play another tank. Maybe I'm unique on that. Maybe that's just something I would prefer. Hell, I never really found any job that I'm ride or die for, and I probably won't ever. I like mixing things up most of the time. I like, a greater diversity in my playing experience, but I think it would be healthier for the community if people, we have the system where you can switch jobs. We have this ability, so let's use it. Maybe that's just me. I suppose at the end of the day, my big hope is that the obvious problems with splitting jobs in the way we assume that they are basically just coming from the language they use to describe it, and that's not actually what they're going to do. I guess I'm basically just deluding myself, if I really come down to it. I'm reading at least pretty deeply into something with unknown depth. Maybe it's a puddle, maybe it's an ocean. If tanks are truly split between off-tank and main tank, then that comes with a whole slew of new problems. I don't think it's game ruining, but it will certainly be a step down in terms of choice. even then, I think it's probably worth it to allow them to make use of the full design space of possible tank jobs. There is so much good that can come from these tank changes. The game can get so much better, so much more fun, but it could also, suck more and in different ways. It's kind of a crapshoot, and it's up to Square to make it good or bad. In my ideal world, the off-tank and main tank split will create a spectrum in which tanks now exist, and it will define more their abilities rather than their actual use in combat. I hope that in certain fights, it will be more beneficial to have 2 off-tanks, and others, 2 main tanks is much superior. I hope that with the other changes coming, this type of switching between jobs will be more accessible and more acceptable. These are all things I hope, but these things have not been explicitly told. The base assumptions that we can make from the language that they use is that all tanks will become more restrictive, that group dynamics will be disturbed, and that is concerning. I suppose at the end of the day, the real thing that matters, the real axis on which this hinges, on whether this is a good change or a bad change, will come down to whether or not I trust Square Enix. And that is such a tough thing to ask. I don't know. But you know what? I'm willing to give them a shot. It could go so good, so let's not blow up for fear of them fucking it up. The changes coming to tanks in Evercold are going to bring a new age of tanking, and I at least believe, for now, that it's going to be fun. Thank you so much for watching. If you think I'm a delusional idiot, please let me know in the comments. If I'm foolish to trust Square to do anything right, tell me. And I'm sure there's a large historical bent that I'm missing for this topic, so if you want to bring up some of that in the comments, please do so as well. Otherwise, please like, please subscribe, and stick around for more 14 videos to come. And yeah, regardless of all that, take it easy and remember to give tanks for what you got, because it might go away. Ta-ta!